In our first segment today, we're going to talk about quality of life programs and homelessness. And to some extent, we're also going to touch on this with poverty as well. But mostly we're going to be focusing on homelessness because that's where there is a huge lack of quality of life programs. Now, as I've already said in the previous episode of my podcast, I was homeless for a number of years. And the shelter I was staying at offered tons of quality of life programs designed to enhance the dignity and humanity of the person who is staying at the shelter. And there are also a lot of other homeless related services that also fail to address some of these issues. It's not just limited to those operating in the shelter. It just seems like no one really cares about making sure that people who are homeless still have some degree of quality of life supports. And when I talk about quality of life supports, I'm not just talking about the basic, let's just make sure that, they're fed and they have a mat. I'm talking about things that help the homeless community actually feel like a community, feel empowered, and additionally have some kind of mental health activity. Anyways, this particular shelter used to have several programs. This included an art program, and this art program had all sorts of branches to it. It had painting, and they would provide all of the materials. And that included brushes, canvases, paints. It was all provided so long as you cleaned up after yourself after you used the space. They also had a kiln if you wanted to do pottery. It had tools for engraving. And there's also a bit of a business aspect to it as well. While they didn't go out of their way to teach entrepreneurship, for example, they would allow people to put their artwork on display where visitors and donors and board members could see them and to offer them for a price. So their recommendation was $10 for every hour you worked on the piece. And that's actually wasn't too bad of a deal then, considering that that was well above minimum wage. Minimum wage was, I believe, $7.90 at that time. So you're actually getting an above minimum wage deal for that. The downside is that the shelter would take these pieces and they would take a 10% gallery fee, which I think was fair. They would only take that gallery fee though if you were selling the artwork. If you weren't selling the artwork, there was no fee to just put it up for people to view, which was nice. They also had leather working. If you wanted to make leather-bound journals or books, you could do that. I actually had a friend who's actually working on making some chainmail in this program. And they also had music instructors come in if you wanted to learn a musical instrument, particularly guitar and piano. They also had a theater program. And the theater program started off as an improv team, and then we were getting bookings, and then we were getting paid to actually do performances because we were getting bookings. So there was that business side to it. And then eventually we moved on from just being an improv troupe to putting on productions with verb theater and downstage theater and making connections. I got to take a creative writing class under Eugene Stickland. Now, for those of you who don't know, I actually went to college to study theater arts. I dropped out of college partially because I did not do too good in my non-theater classes. but also because it was a Bible college. And while I was relatively religious at that time, I was still a progressive, so I didn't really fit in with a lot of the students and faculty there. And additionally, I saw that a lot of the students who were graduating were getting volunteer positions at churches, and I did not want to flush a whole bunch of student loan money down the drain in order to not get paid. So I dropped out, but because I had some of that training, I was able to get that foothold in the theater industry through these programs that the shelter was offering. And I got to take that creative writing class under Eugene Stickland, who's a hero to me. He's someone that I've idolized and looked up to, and someone whose writing I had admired. And I would strongly recommend you go out and purchase a copy of his play, Some Assembly Required. It's a wonderful Christmas story, bit of a black comedy, but it's like a Christmas play for modern times, dysfunctional families, characters we can relate to. Back to the case at point, though, I was able to build a lot of connections, and even after that program closed, I was still able to maintain some of those connections. I was able to do some work later on with Downstage Theater on a program called Bottle Pickers Monologues. So this program was not a waste of time. And this program was not only good for my mental health, but good for the mental health of those who participated in it. It helped us build relationships. It helped us learn to form a community. And that program no longer exists. Yet the volunteers who were running the art program felt the program was so important that for a while, and I'm not even sure if they're still doing this, but for a while, they were actually running the program out of a garage after the shelter cut funding towards the program. Now, the reason why the shelter cut funding towards the program is because there's no money in encouraging arts. People want something with tangible numbers that you can see, and that's what donors want. And so those tangible numbers are how many people got jobs, how many people got homes. Those are the measurables. And so without those measurables, there was a change in focus in the direction that the shelter wanted to go. Other quality of life programs that were cut were education based. At the same time they closed the art program, they also closed down the education program. And there were other things in the education program that many people were involved in who were left in the lurch. There was basic computer skills programs. And when I say basic, I mean these were designed for people who did not know how to open an internet browser, how to create an email address. Is basically if you knew how to turn a computer on, but nothing else, this was a program for you. And those are actually important employment related because you're going to need those skills to write a resume. You're going to need those skills to apply for jobs. There was also a public speaking program, and it was tied to Toastmasters, though it wasn't a Toastmasters itself. It was rather sponsored by Toastmasters. And as a part of that, we also had a bit of a debate club. And this allowed us to learn how to resolve conflict, how to use evidence-based approaches to resolve disputes. And it allowed us to realize that conflict isn't always a bad thing, that you can be civil. But public speaking is also important when it comes to building up confidence. Any job you want, you're going to want to be a confident speaker. Even say a job interview. How are you going to walk into a job interview without having those speaking skills, without being able to represent yourself, without being able to advocate yourself? So these are programs that are still important, but they also are important for a quality of life because they give someone a sense of self-worth. They're important for mental health. They're important for allowing us to feel like we deserve better. It's said that when someone comes out of homelessness and into housing, they go through the revolving door 7 times before they become permanently housed. That's an average, and I'm not sure where that statistic actually comes from, but that's a phrase that's been bandied about among workers for a number of years. And part of that might be that that person doesn't feel confident in there, that person doesn't feel like they belong in housing. People need a sense of belonging. They need a sense of community, and they don't necessarily have to feel like they belong in a shelter, but they should feel like they belong somewhere. Especially if we're trying to tell communities that they need to allow affordable housing projects in, we need to make sure that people who are coming out of homelessness have that sense of community, that they know what it feels like to belong in a community. Now, most programs geared towards those who are homeless center around one of 3 areas, and that is employment, that is housing, and at religious institutions, Bible studies. That's really about it. And I'm going to talk about what my favorite program was at any of these organizations. We had something called Philosophy Cafe. It was a dialectic discussion, and I am a lover of philosophy. I could list off some of my favorite philosophers, everything from Socrates, not Plato. And we can also debate the historical authenticity of Socrates, but we were discussing a lot of contemporary philosophy and a lot of economics. And there's about 10 to 15 of us. We'd sit down for breakfast on weekends, and we would have a philosophical discussion, and it was purely discussion based. Sometimes there would be a bit of a leader or a facilitator, but the idea was to basically be philosophers. And you don't need that university education to be a philosopher. You just need to know how the dialectic works and how to hold dialogues in large groups. And so we had discussed everything from evolution from a philosophy point. We had chapters and meetings on Richard Dawkins. We had discussed Adam Smith versus Marx in terms of capitalism and communism. We had discussed Chomsky. I'm a huge fan of Noam Chomsky. And we also discussed racial and religious discrimination. And we were a community. We were a wonderful community. And it even spread to outside of these things, because then we'd start meeting for breakfast in the shelters. And those of us who were part of this philosophy cafe would then be sitting in the shelters, and we'd have our breakfast at the shelter on a weekday. And we would start discussing what is the nature of time, and is time real? The church of 5 minutes ago, if you will, and other topics. And it was wonderful because we got to show that we were smart, that we could have civil discussions, and we had that sense of self-worth and community. And we translate these skills into the real world. And some of the outcomes that this had is I was able to work with Downstage Theatre thanks to my partnership with the Bottle Pickers Association of Calgary and Calgary Can. And we partnered with Downstage to put on a production called Bottle Picker Monologues, a theatrical presentation telling the stories of bottle pickers in a variety of monologue style formats. This included everything from a question and answer period between one of the downstage hands and a bottle picker, to one-man shows about 10 minutes long that had actually no dialogue and were all physically performed on the stage through action, to a 5-minute segment that I wrote designed to sound like a radio play. But the idea is that this was a production created by members of the bottle picking community to tell the story of bottle picking community. Other outcomes have been, since a few of us have become housed since then, I was able to apply for and won a grant in a competition where residents of the neighborhood that I was living in got to vote on who got the funding. And I won this grant to hold a Yes in My Backyard barbecue to thank the community that I live in for being so open to low income housing. Home Space Society has several buildings in our neighborhood. Calgary Housing has several buildings in our neighborhood. There's an addictions treatment center in our neighborhood. And yet, a block away from where I live, there's multi-million-dollar riverside homes. We have been a very blended neighborhood, and I wanted to do something to thank the community for being such gracious hosts to those of us who are living in poverty. And because I had a sense of community, I was able to fight to get this grant, got awarded it, and do something wonderful for the neighborhood because I know what community means. Another friend of mine in another neighborhood was actually nominated for Neighbor of the Year. He also ended up winning Volunteer of the Year from the Calgary Homeless Foundation. Someone else who lives in the south end of town started a big lunch program for students in the neighborhood. And so when you work on quality of life programs, you're not only enhancing the mental health of those who are living on the streets, you are setting them up to be contributing members to the communities that they are going to move into when they segue off the streets. You are filling them with a sense of accountability and responsibility to the neighborhoods that they are living in, which means that they are going to do the things that they need to do to stay housed. It's like, I can't speak about jail, but I've always lived with a philosophy. If you treat someone like a monster for however long that they're in prison, how do you expect to release anything back into society besides a monster? We've redirected our systems and services so that they are essentially punishing people for being homeless. And how do we expect to put responsible citizens into the community under that idea? We're saying, oh, you don't have a job, you don't have a home, so we're going to make sure that you feel like garbage while you're living here. And that might not be intentional, but that is definitely a byproduct of taking away these quality of life programs and focusing it entirely on those two areas. And I don't want to say that housing and employment aren't important. They absolutely are. They are so important. But we need to ensure that people who are living in homelessness have that sense of belonging, that they know what it's like to be part of a community, that they don't feel like a monster, that they don't feel like they're a failure just for being homeless. And so we have to bring back some of these quality of life programs and enhance the lives of those who are experiencing homelessness so that they know that, yes, You are on the streets right now, but you still matter. We've got to stop using our systems to punish people for being homeless. I like to believe that for 90% of cases, homelessness is not a choice. And even if it is, basic capitalist theory, the first couple of pages in any economics textbook will tell you that people make the choices that are in their best self-interest. So if homelessness is a choice in their best interest, what were the other choices? They must have been pretty bad, and that is a failure on society. So even when someone does choose homelessness, that is a failure on society to address a missing need. And even if people make the wrong choices, that choice should not become a life sentence. We should not be continually punishing people for those choices. We have to give them the opportunities to succeed, and these quality of life programs will do that. We need to restore them. We need to enhance them. We need to support them, and we need to fund them. Otherwise, we are going to continue to see this cycle of a revolving door in and out of the streets, because we have failed to actually put valid members of community into communities, because we have failed to create members of community. Hey there, YouTube audience. This is Nigel, the host of PovPolPodcast. Do you like what you just heard? Are you interested in hearing more? Then please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, and click on the link provided to listen to the full episode.